I was 15 when it occurred. It was a Friday evening toward the end of September, and the air had just begun to turn chilly where I lived. My parents had gone out to dinner with some family friends and told me they wouldn't be back until late. That left me alone in the house. I invited my neighbor and closest friend, Chris, to come over. He was my age and lived directly across the street. We usually spent time in my basement playing games or watching movies. But that night, we ended up feeling restless. Eventually, he suggested we play hide and seek. At first, it sounded stupid, but we had played it before with a group, and it had actually been fun. The house wasn't very big, but it had plenty of hiding spots, especially when it was dark. We switched off most of the lights to make things creepier. The only light left on was in the kitchen. The rules were easy. No going outside, no attic or crawl space. The basement, bedrooms, closets, and hiding under furniture were all allowed. Chris wanted to hide first, so I stood in the living room, covered my eyes, and counted to 50. At first, I heard him running. Then everything went quiet. When I finished counting, I called out that I was coming. I checked the kitchen first since it was nearby, but there was nowhere he could be. I looked behind the basement door, then walked down the hallway. The bathroom was empty. I opened the closet near the front door. Nothing. I headed upstairs. The floor creaked with every step, and each small noise made my body tense. I searched my parents' bedroom first, checking under the bed and behind the dresser. No one. I walked down the hall into my room. It was messy, but not messy enough to hide a person. Still, I checked the closet and under the desk. Nothing there. That left the guest room at the end of the hall. Its door was slightly open. I pushed it gently, expecting him to leap out and scare me, but the room was dark and silent. I stepped inside and looked around. I crouched to check beneath the bed. Empty. I opened the closet. Nothing. I figured he must be in the basement, so I went back downstairs. I searched behind the washing machines and inside the storage area under the stairs. Just when I was about to give up, I finally spotted him, curled up behind some boxes. He laughed and asked how long it took me to find him. I said way longer than it should have. Then we switched roles. He counted, and I went to hide. I went upstairs and slid under the guest bed, pulling the bed skirt down so it hid me completely. My heart was pounding as I lay there in the darkness. A few minutes later, I heard him come upstairs, his footsteps slow and heavy. He opened the bathroom door first, then walked into my parents' room. After some time, his footsteps moved down the hall toward me. I could hear his breathing as he entered the guest room. He stopped near the bed. I held my breath. His shoes shifted against the carpet. Then nothing. Complete silence. I thought he had figured it out and was about to pull the bed skirt up, but instead, he walked away. I stayed there for a few more minutes, waiting to hear him announce that I had won, but the house remained unnaturally quiet. Finally, I crawled out. I went downstairs, expecting to see him on the couch, but he wasn't there. I called out that the game was over. A voice answered from the basement, saying he was down there. I assumed he was joking around. I walked to the basement door, opened it, and shouted down the stairs. He yelled back that he was still searching for me and asked where I was hiding. My stomach tightened. I told him I was done hiding and standing in the kitchen. A second later, I heard him climbing the stairs. He stepped into the light, looking confused. He asked how I managed to get upstairs so quickly. I told him I had been under the guest bed the entire time. He frowned and said he was sure he had checked that room and heard someone moving inside. He said he thought he heard breathing. I told him I hadn't moved at all. We went back and forth for a bit, then brushed it off. We played another round, but the whole time I felt on edge. Every creak in the house made me flinch. While I was counting during one round, I thought I heard something upstairs, like a soft thump. But when I searched, nothing was there. I found Chris hiding in the laundry room. We kept playing until we were both exhausted. After that, we sat on the living room couch and turned the TV back on. That's when we both froze. There was a loud bang upstairs, like something heavy hitting the floor. Chris asked if my parents were home. I reminded him they were still out. The hair on my arms stood straight up. We waited, but everything went quiet again. Chris suggested maybe something had fallen off a shelf. I wanted to believe that, but then we both heard it clearly. A slow creak of floorboards. The sound of someone walking down the upstairs hallway. We stared at each other, neither of us moving. I whispered that maybe we should go check. Chris shook his head and said, "No way. But if someone broke in, we couldn't just sit here." I told him to stay behind me and grabbed the fireplace poker next to the couch. We slowly climbed the stairs. The house was so silent, I could hear my own breathing. Each step groaned beneath our weight. When we reached the top, I pointed toward the guest room. The door was closed now. I knew for sure I had left it partly open. We stood there, frozen. Then a sound came from behind the door. A slow dragging noise, like fabric being pulled across the carpet. Chris whispered that we should leave. I wanted to, but fear and curiosity held me there. I raised the poker and reached for the handle. When I say my hands were shaking, I'm not exaggerating for effect. I shoved the door open. The room was dark, but I could make out the bed and dresser. No one was inside. The closet door was ajar. I edged nearer while Chris lingered in the doorway. I pulled the closet door wide open. Inside, there was nothing except hanging coats and stacked boxes. We both laughed nervously, convincing ourselves it was just our imagination. But right as we turned away, another noise broke the silence. This time, it didn't come from upstairs. It came from below. The unmistakable sound of the front door opening and shutting. We froze once more. Chris murmured that someone was inside the house. My stomach sank instantly. We hurried down the hallway and hid in my room, crouching in the dark with the lights off. I gripped the poker as tightly as I could. We listened, and for a moment, there was nothing at all. Then faint footsteps echoed from the first floor. I wanted to dial the police, but my phone was still on the couch where we had been sitting earlier. I whispered that we might be able to escape through the window, but it was far too small. The only way out was down the hallway, past the staircase. The footsteps crept closer. Then we heard the basement door open. Footsteps descended one step at a time. We both breathed out in relief. Whoever it was had gone into the basement, so we took our chance and ran. We bolted down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the back door into the yard. We didn't stop until we reached Chris's house across the street. His parents were home, and when we told them what happened, they called the police. The officers searched my house from top to bottom and found nothing. No forced entry, no one hiding in the basement. They said it was probably the house settling or our imaginations running wild while we played. But Chris and I both knew what we heard. We knew someone had been there. For weeks afterward, I barely slept. Every creak made me think someone was standing in the hallway. That was the last time I ever played hide and seek. We were too old for it anyway. Chris and I rarely talked about it again. But sometimes when our eyes meet, I know we're both thinking about that night. The night hide and seek became something else. Even now, years later, I still remember the sound of the closet door, the scraping noise across the carpet, and the footsteps downstairs. We never learned who it was. Maybe a burglar who realized we were still home. Maybe someone who slipped away while we ran. All I know is that playing hide and seek that night taught us how terrifying it is to realize you aren't alone in your own house. I grew up in a neighborhood that backed directly onto a stretch of woods. Houses lined one side of the street, and behind them were endless trees stretching for miles. When I was younger, a group of kids from the street played together almost every weekend. In the summer, we stayed outside late into the night, sometimes until our parents shouted for us to come inside. One of our favorite games was hide and seek. We usually played in the backyards and along the edge of the woods. It was fun during the day, but at night it felt different. The trees swallowed the light, and everything looked the same no matter where you stood. That was what made it frightening, and that was what made it exciting. The last time I ever played hide and seek in those woods was when I was 14. It was August, hot and sticky even after dark. There were 5 of us: me, my friend Tyler, his younger brother Matt, and 2 kids from down the street, Jason and Eric. We decided to play outside because it felt cooler than sitting in someone's basement. The rules were simple. You could hide anywhere, in the backyards or the woods, but you had to stay close enough to hear when the seeker called the game over. Jason volunteered to be it first. The rest of us scattered. I headed into the woods with Tyler. Once we passed the first line of trees, we split up. I crouched behind a fallen log, my heart pounding even though it was just a game. I could hear Jason counting back in the yard, his voice echoing through the darkness. When he finished, everything went silent. Crickets buzzed nearby, and leaves shifted in the breeze. I stayed low and completely still. After a while, I heard footsteps crunching through the leaves. They moved between the trees. I assumed it was Jason. I held my breath and waited for him to pass. The footsteps stopped not far from me. Whoever it was just stood there. I waited for them to speak or move again, but they didn't. My skin prickled. I almost whispered to ask who it was, but then I remembered the rules. If I revealed myself, I would lose, so I stayed frozen. Finally, the footsteps started again. They crunched away, moving deeper into the woods. I listened until the sound faded. I peeked over the log, but it was too dark to see much. Moonlight barely touched the treetops. I stayed hidden a few more minutes before growing impatient. I crawled out and began creeping back toward the yards. As I walked, I heard Jason shouting that the round was over and everyone should come out. I hurried back and found the others already gathered in the yard. Jason had found Tyler and Eric, but not me or Matt. Matt emerged from the woods a minute later, dirty and laughing. He said no one would have ever found him. I told them I had been behind the log and nearly got caught when Jason walked right past me. But Jason looked confused. He said he never went that deep into the woods. He claimed he stayed near the first trees and found Tyler by a fence. I frowned and asked who it was that had walked by me. but everyone just shrugged. We brushed it off and kept playing. The next round, I was the seeker. I counted loudly against a tree while the others ran off. When I finished, I searched the yards first. I found Eric behind a shed and Tyler hiding in some bushes. Then I went into the woods to look for Jason and Matt. The forest was quiet, except for insects. My flashlight beam swept between the trees. I listened closely for movement. After a while, I spotted Matt crouched near a tree trunk. I yelled that I found him, and he sprinted back laughing. That left Jason. I moved deeper into the woods, calling out that I was coming. That's when I heard it again. The footsteps. Slow, heavy steps moving through the darkness. They came from just ahead of me. I shined my flashlight in that direction, but the trees were thick. I advanced carefully, trying to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped. I waited. By then, I was starting to feel uneasy. Then I heard Jason shout from behind me that the round was over. I spun around and saw him already heading back to the yard. Confused, I asked if he had been in front of me. He said no. He'd been hiding closer to the house the entire time. My stomach twisted. Twice now, I had heard someone moving through the woods who wasn't one of us. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but the footsteps sounded human, too heavy for a raccoon, or fox, even a deer. We played a few more rounds. Every time I hid, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there. I kept hearing faint sounds in the trees, branches snapping, leaves crunching. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow shift between the trees. But when I aimed my flashlight, it vanished. The others noticed nothing. They just laughed and ran around. I tried to act normal, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. During the last round of the night, Jason wanted to hide in the woods again. We split up like before. I didn't want to go far, so I stayed near the edge. I crouched low in the tall grass. Through the trees, I could see the faint glow of porch lights. I heard Jason's distant voice counting. When he finished, the woods fell silent again. After a few minutes, I heard something that made me freeze, whispering. A low voice, too quiet to understand, but close. My entire body tensed. I peeked over the grass, but the woods looked empty. I listened carefully, but the whispering stopped. Moments later, I heard footsteps again. They moved past me and deeper into the trees. I lay there shaking. Then Jason called out that the game was over. Everyone else emerged, laughing and brushing dirt off their clothes. I walked back slowly, my heart still racing. I told them I had heard someone whispering, but they just laughed and said I was trying to scare them. I didn't argue. I knew what I heard. We sat in Tyler's yard afterward, drinking soda and talking. That's when Matt asked if anyone else had seen the man. We all went quiet and stared at him. He said that while he was hiding, he thought he saw a tall man standing in the woods. He said the man didn't move at all, just stood there staring. Jason told him he was imagining things. Eric laughed it off, but I felt nauseous because I believed him. Not long after that, we called it a night. Everyone headed home. I lay awake in my bed, staring up at the ceiling, unable to fall asleep. In my mind, I kept replaying the whispering sounds and the slow crunch of footsteps in the leaves. I never played hide and seek in the woods again. Even now, years later, whenever I hear leaves crunching in the dark, my thoughts drift back to that night. I think about the man Matt claimed he saw. I think about the footsteps that didn't belong to Jason, and the whisper I still can't explain. Maybe it was a stranger passing through. Maybe it was someone who lived out there. All I know is that when you hide in the dark woods, you never truly know who else might be hiding with you. It was a scorching Saturday afternoon, last July. I was 14 at the time and lived in a rural area of Pennsylvania. My backyard is massive, with acres of open grass, trees, and an old storage shed sitting at the edge of the property. My friends and I spent nearly every summer day out there. That day, it was me, Ryan, Josh, and Adam. We were just fooling around, playing basketball on the hoop my dad had mounted near the garage. After about an hour, we were exhausted, sprawled out in the grass, sweaty, and gulping down water. That's when we noticed a kid we didn't recognize walking up from the dirt road that runs past my house. He looked around 16, older than us, and taller too. He had messy black hair and was wearing a gray shirt and jeans despite the heat. We all went quiet as we watched him approach. He walked straight up, like he already knew us, and asked if we wanted to even things out and make it 3-on-3. None of us answered right away. Finally, Adam asked who he was. The kid said his name was Keith. He claimed he lived just up the road and had been walking through the woods when he spotted us. We all exchanged looks. I'd lived there my entire life and had never seen this kid before. Neither had my friends. But he seemed normal enough, I guess. Ben asked if he wanted to play basketball. Keith shook his head and suggested we play manhunt instead. He said my yard was perfect for it because there were so many places to hide. At the time, none of us thought much about that comment. But looking back, it should have set off alarms. How would he know anything about my property? Still, we agreed. It sounded better than standing around in the heat. We split into 2 teams. Keith immediately volunteered to be a hunter. He said he loved seeking, so it was Keith, Adam, and Josh hunting, while me, Ryan, and Ben hid. Adam kicked a soccer ball to signal the start. We scattered across the yard as the hunters covered their eyes and counted. Ryan ran toward the tree line, then cut toward the side of the garage. I didn't want to go into the woods yet, so I headed for the storage shed. Inside, it smelled like gasoline and old wood. I spotted a stack of folded tarps in the corner, crawled under one, and stayed perfectly still. I was under there for at least 10 minutes. Though it felt much longer, no one came. I started thinking maybe the hunters had quit, when the shed door suddenly creaked open. The tarp was yanked off me in one swift motion. I guess it was an obvious hiding spot. I looked up and saw Adam grinning down at me. We walked back to the patio together. A few minutes later, Ben came back too. He'd been caught as well. Eventually, Adam and Josh returned. We stood around drinking water, but Keith was missing. At first, nobody mentioned it. Then Josh asked where Keith went. None of us had any idea. We waited another 10 minutes, expecting him to show up, but he never did. Adam finally shrugged and said, maybe he was just some strange kid who left. We agreed, though it felt weird that he'd vanish without a word. When everyone else went home around sunset, I went inside. That's when I noticed something strange near my bedroom window. Lying in the grass was a piece of rope. It looked worn and dirty, like it had been there for months, but I knew it hadn't been there earlier. I picked it up and tossed it aside, but it stuck in my mind. My first thought was Keith. I told myself I was overthinking it. Later that evening, though, I couldn't shake the idea that he might have gone into the house while we were distracted. My dad usually leaves one of the side doors unlocked during the day. I searched every room, checking closets and under beds. Nothing. Around 11 o'clock, I got ready for bed. I lay there for about an hour, scrolling on my phone when I heard something. Soft footsteps outside my door. I froze. My dad sometimes gets up at night to use the bathroom, but he always coughs or clears his throat. This was silent. Too silent. I called out for him. No response. My heart was racing as I sat up. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I got up and locked it. I stood there staring at the handle, waiting. About 30 seconds later, I heard the front door slam shut, the sound echoing through the house. I didn't hesitate. I ran to my dad's room and shook him awake. He sat up groggily as I told him what happened. He didn't question me. He grabbed the shotgun from under his bed and told me to stay close. We searched the entire house together. Every closet, the basement, the garage. He even walked the property outside with a flashlight, but found nothing. After that, we locked every door and window. The next day, I told my friends. They laughed it off, saying Keith was probably just some random weirdo. But Ryan admitted he thought Keith was strange too. He said Keith barely spoke during the game. He mostly just stared. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, a scratching sound woke me up. It was coming from my bedroom window. I froze, staring at the blinds. The scratching was slow, like someone dragging a stick or a nail across the glass. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I carefully bent one of the blinds open, just a little. On the other side was a figure. I couldn't see his face, only the outline of someone standing inches away in the darkness. I jumped back and screamed for my dad. I ran into the hallway, yelling until he came out of his room. He didn't hesitate. He ran outside with the shotgun, firing 2 shots into the air and shouting that he'd shoot whoever was out there if they came back. The figure was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the living room with the lights on while my dad stayed awake too. The next morning, he told me he believed Keith had been the one messing with us. He said if that kid ever came back, he'd shoot him. I know he wasn't entirely serious, but that's just how my dad talks. He said that kid was never welcome near our house again. As far as I know, Keith never returned. But sometimes, when I'm outside at night, I think about that rope beneath my window, and I wonder what he planned to do if I hadn't woken up when I did.